so we can change people by way of expressing our commitments through policy decisions, as opposed to waiting for people to change.
My children going to school with Black children, they're not going to get eaten by those Black children. If anything, they're going to befriend and learn from those Black children. It becomes then harder to fearmonger, let's say, segregated schools.
I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, a time in which young Black males were classified, like me, were classified as super predators. Our communities were imagined to be severely dangerous. These were racist ideas circulating not only among white people, but even among Black people. And young people like me were internalizing these ideas. I believed it until I realized that there was nothing, the only thing wrong with Black people was that we thought something was wrong with Black people. And that the fundamental racial problem was racist policy.
Habit formation is always bound up with character formation, because habits, as Aristotle would say, are critical to the kinds of persons we take ourselves to be. The important question, what kind of human being do you take yourself to be? And it seems to me if we lose sight of that question and become technocratic in terms of how we think about policy and the like, we might find ourselves where you go.
ICE trampling upon the rights of everyday ordinary folk, not only American citizens, but those who are here legally, those who are just simply trying to make a better life for themselves and their children. These folk aren't going after hardened criminals. They're not in ICE in Minneapolis or Minnesota because of fraud. I've said over and over again that ICE has been charged to do what? To make America white again.
That's all I need.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching this video from. As you know, I'm your host and presenter Introductory. Now, the following two people are Ibrahim X. Kendi and Eddie Glaude Jr. Now, these are two professors that have tried to study the problems surrounding Black Americans, or things that are affecting Black Americans. And one thing that stands out, which was still back in the 80s and it is still right now, is racist ideas which are being spread about Black people. And this somehow affects Black people, because see, when people around you keeps on saying things negative about you, somehow or somewhere you can internalize all these stereotypes, although they are not true, but somehow psychologically they get to affect you. Now, Eddie Glaude Jr. and Ibrahim X. Kendi tries to expound on all these ideas so that we can all get to understand, and they break down all these ideas and how these racist ideas spread. Brothers and sisters, I want us to watch this video. It's indeed a long video, but it is worth your time, because we are going to demystify all this information, break them down in ways that all of us can understand. Brothers and sisters, I didn't have much to say, but I was really happy in learning, in understanding how all these things all came to happen. Because let's just be honest, we all need this information. Because when somebody tells you that racism ended a long time ago, brothers and sisters, these are people who are colorblind. And when I say colorblind, I don't mean a genetic disorder. I'm talking about a problem. Right? I'm talking about a predicament that is affecting the United States until today. Something that people don't have the balls of talking about them. People don't have the guts of talking about them. But brothers and sisters, these are things that are still affecting Black people, and they need to be talked about. So if you're watching me for the first time, you know I'm your host and presenter Introductory. And brothers and sisters, I'll be watching with you this video. I'll be learning alongside with you. Let me know what you think about in the comment section in regards to this video. And for those watching me for the first time, kindly make sure you subscribe, like, share, so that we can all get to learn all these concepts, so that this video reaches majority of people, so that we can get to learn about this. So let's watch the video. I'll be back with my thoughts and commentaries in regards to this. So let's watch the video.
To do is to admit to you that I am in fact, that the country is in fact racist, and that admission should call for absolution. I'm Eddie Glaude, professor of African American Studies at Princeton University.
I'm Ibrahim Kendi. I am professor of history at Howard University.
I like that question. Policy or the moral imagination? What do you make of that? Is that a false opposition?
I think so. I think it's typically very difficult to radically change policies without a moral imagination. I don't know. What do you think?
You know, in my book, Democracy in Black, I actually linked policy to habit formation, that we can change certain sorts of arrangements. Or you can pass policies that reflect a particular set of values, and those policies can then reorient us, redirect us. And part of this is, I use the example in the text, right? That I don't like stepping on cold floors when I wake up. And so to avoid stepping on cold floors, I decided to deliberately put my house shoes right next to the bed where my feet would land. And that habit oriented me. And so there's a way in which you can engage in habit formation through policy that can then have an effect on character. So we can change people by way of expressing our commitments through policy decisions, as opposed to waiting for people to change so that we can change our policies. You see what I mean? So we can actually use policy to generate different habits.
Yeah, and I mean, what we think of, particularly American history, many of the policymakers had to have a moral imagination in order to institute a policy that was, let's say, not popular. Mm-hmm. And I think that on some level came from their morality. I think obviously in many cases it came from their own self-interest in different types of ways. But I think there have been policymakers who recognized that once we transform policies and once people see that, let's say in the case that, my children going to school with Black children, they're not going to get eaten by those Black children. If anything, they're going to befriend and learn from those Black children. It becomes then harder to fearmonger, about, let's say, segregated schools. And I think that, but somebody has to do the courageous thing and institute policies will break down racist sort of elements of racist systems. And I think that's where we've been lacking.
Yeah, I think that what I was trying to say, and I think you're right here, is that it's a false opposition, right? Policy can be used to orient us in a different sort of way to each other. We might not be able to change the hearts of racists, but we can keep them from acting in a racist way. And that puts in place the conditions for the possibility of change or shift. We could habituate ourselves differently. There's no guarantee. But it's also the case, it seems to me, that I think Madison is right, that democracies, in order for democracies to work, it requires a certain kind of virtuous person. And for me, habit formation is always bound up with character formation, because habits, as Aristotle would say, are critical to the kinds of persons we take ourselves to be. So if you have a public policy space that's completely eviscerated by neoliberal ends and commitments, that's going to reflect a certain set of values that are antithetical to a certain way of thinking about community and the like, of thinking about how we might value human beings, or it might value more human beings who have money, who are heterosexual, who are male, and who are white in a different way. So part of what I'm trying to suggest is that we don't want to think about these things as antithetical. But with Baldwin, the moral question is always paramount, because he's grappling with the important question is, what kind of human being do you take yourself to be? And it seems to me if we lose sight of that question and become technocratic in terms of how we think about policy and the like, we might find ourselves where you thought. What do you think about that?
I do, and I also see a continuous and relentless effort to almost normalize immorality, for the lack of a better sort of concept, and the way that has been done historically, and I tried to show in my work, has been through the production and circulation of racist ideas, which then, and even other forms of bigotry. So that's what your consumption of those ideas, you're believing those ideas to be normality or to be natural, or that, to your point, you're led to believe that certain groups should be valued more than others. That then leads to a sort of a practice immorality that you tell yourself is actually quite moral. And I think that then leads you to defend policies, or even welcome policies, or even empower policymakers who maintain injustice under the pretext of justice.
So yeah, this is really important, Mark. So how then do you address that? Because I take the question that's being asked of us. Do you address that reality that you just described by way of policy or by way of the moral appeal? Or, right, is it some internalized effort, right? You got to grapple with, because there's one way of reading how to be an anti-racist, right? Is that there's something inside of you that you have to tend to, that the socialization into, to use your language, immorality, right? The fact that you see the world colored through this lens that allows you to view that some people, because of the color of their skin, are valued more than others. That what's really needed is attending to those beliefs in you as the precondition for changing it. Or what do you make of that? Is that a caricature of your position?
Well, I would say that I think one tradition, particularly within the Black radical tradition, has been for us as Black people to constantly be interrogating and raising our consciousness. So our consciousness, and that when I was growing up, there was a difference between, are you conscious or not, right? And so what did that mean? What did it mean to be conscious? Or what did it mean in the 70s when you had Black people gathering together to raise their consciousness, or even women having consciousness raising sort of sessions, with second wave feminists? Like, what did that actually mean? And I think some people could read those gatherings, even read those efforts to gain a sense of consciousness as simply this individual trying to enlighten themselves or gain knowledge for knowledge's sake. But I think what was actually happening, and certainly this is what I attempted to do with my book, is you're seeking to understand and gain a better sense of the world that you're living in so you can radically transform it. And how do you go about gaining a sense of consciousness of your own ideas that are causing you to see Black people as the problem, as opposed to the structure of racism? But what I did not write about, and what I think you've written about beautifully, and I think this again speaks to the question at hand, is, so where does morality play in that? Like, that's not, it's not necessarily something that I have written about, or even really understood, which is why I'm just interested in this conversation.
Yeah.
Because I think it's forcing me to sort of think about things in a new or different way.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think it's really important for us to ask ourselves the question, what kind of human beings do democracies require? What are the underlying assumptions, preconditions that make democratic life possible? So I'm fond of saying that Abraham Lincoln couldn't be like the kind of man that his conception of democracy required, because he was too willing at times to throw everything away because of his commitment to the idea or the belief that some people, because of the color of their skin, are valued more than others. So democracy would distort it and disfigure in this moment, right? So, this question, and the moral question isn't some kind of moralist question, right? It's about character formation, right? But how does one?
Can I just ask something?
Sure.
Why do you think? Because I think for the better part of the last 60 years, we were openly having a conversation about the moral question.
Mm.
But I think, particularly in the last 10 years, if not longer, that has not been a part of our political discourse.
Mm.
Certainly our political racial discourse. Is that something you see, or am I mean, I know that we've been trying to elevate that. We've been trying, but it seems as if those gatekeepers of the discourse don't want us to have that type of conversation. What do you think?
I think it's a moral. So I think that we don't want to segment the question. I think it's a moral question and an ethical question about the social safety net, right? What are our obligations to each other as people in community with one another, right? So, what does it mean to see policy decisions since 1980 that have gutted any concern for the poor? That to me is a moral question.
It is.
Right. What does it mean for neoliberal political economy to define or to empty or eviscerate any notion of the public good, such that we become these selfish, self-interested persons in competition and rivalry with others in pursuit of our own aims and ends? That to me is a moral question with policy implications, right? So I think since 1980, we've been in a place in this country where a certain conception of what the role of government is, what the role of the citizen is, a certain understanding of economy, a certain understanding of this stuff has overwhelmed a kind of more straightforward moral discourse that we tend to associate with a certain version of the 1960s civil rights movement, right? And a certain version of that, right? Yeah. So I don't think it's that the moral question has receded. It's just been answered in a particular sort of way, right? That requires a kind of response. Now, it makes it more difficult when a certain aspect of that civil rights movement has been co-opted and become the left wing of the Democratic Party, a Democratic Party that has, in so many ways, given the third way and DLC and all this other stuff, consented to the terms of the neoliberal picture I just described. So one then has to ask the question, from whence the kind of moral and political critique of the environment in which we find ourselves. And we can begin to lay that out, right? But the question becomes for me, right, is that let's go back to your work, right? So when you drop How to Be an Anti-Racist, if you know how you experienced it, how does that get read? How does that get taken up, right? Does it get taken up in a sentimentalized way? Right? So what it becomes is a matter of feeling, a matter of my own beliefs. And then we don't attend destruction, right? Where we tend to think about only that which is, right, impacting my own moral compass in the life. What do you make of that kind of, the crocodile tea has become the politics, as it were?
Well, let me first say, because I think you're rightfully mentioning this neoliberal age that we find ourselves in, and I just can't help but think about the fact that a few days ago, Chile, which of course the historians have sort of pointed to Chile as the first country to transition into a neoliberal economy under, of course, Augusto Pinochet. And one of the And of course, Pinochet would go on to become one of the most exploitative and murderous dictators in Latin American history. And one of the people who supported Augusto Pinochet was a man by the name of Michael Cast, who fled Nazi Germany after World War II, and with his family. And he became a business owner, quite wealthy, and financed Augusto Pinochet. Well, he had a son by the name of Jose Antonio Cast, who literally just became the president of Chile and has long admired and supported Pinochet. And so it's that age seems to be extending itself literally through dynasty, so to speak. But to your question, I think the challenges, as we all know, when we write books, is it is like, you prepare a meal and you set that meal on the table, and there's 6 different people who are going to eat that, and they're going to all taste it in a different way, based on their own perspectives, based on their own tastes. You have a particular intention behind how you want that food, how you prepared the food, what you want people to feel. But unfortunately, some people are going to feel it in a way that you didn't even intend. And I think, one aspect of the question, I think that's been really, really difficult for me to watch the conversation around how to be an anti-racist was this idea that this was a book that satiated people's feelings. Because one of the final chapters in the book, which is a chapter called Failure, I write about what I call feelings advocacy, to challenge. And I give the example of a person who hears about, let's say, a Black person being murdered by police, and they feel that. And then they hear about a local demonstration, against police violence. And they go to the demonstration. You have a bunch of powerful speakers who are speaking out against that injustice while also sort of trying to galvanize people and generate sort of, let's say, radical hope. And so the person is led to that demonstration by their feelings. In other words, I feel bad. I need to do something. And so they go to the demonstration, they feel better. And the only thing that changes is their feelings. So they don't become a part of that local movement to reduce or eliminate police violence. That demonstration only becomes a vehicle for the transformation momentarily of their feelings. And then the same cycle happens a month later or a year later. And I wrote about that because I wanted to make the case that that's not certainly being anti-racist, right? And I think that is a huge problem.
And you watched it in real time. You watched how the book was being read in real time, how it's sentimentalized, and the relationship between it and rage, and subsequent white rage, as it were.
Yeah, and so I literally wrote, in many cases in the book, wrote against the way that people could ultimately use the book, and it just still didn't matter. But I mean, that's we can't really.
So talk to me about the relationship between, I'm really fascinated about this. Now I'm sitting up here interviewing about the relationship between that, which you take to be the misreading of that book, and the justifications that you see circulating for the assault of DEI under Trumpism, right? Because there's a way in which you can think about how DEI function as a kind of corporate managerial strategy for diversity aimed at increasing, efficiency and productivity among an increasingly diverse workforce, right? to see DEI as somehow shifting the ground of the way in which we understand going from multiculturalism to DEI, going from that which was a problem to that which is a value in the aim and pursuit of more profit and the like, right? And now we're in this moment, right, where DEI is under assault from every corner. And in so many ways, you find yourself as the poster boy of it all, right? Talk about how that misreading, as you say, right, is tied to, or may be tied to, the current moment. Or if it is, do you see it? Because that's not only just you. I mean, it's the way in which Robin DiAngelo was read in these moments, right? So how might we think about the way in which the strong misreading of these works, as you put it, right, serve as justification, right, for the quote unquote wokeism of our, the woke scare that we currently find ourselves in? How do you respond to that?
Well, what's interesting is I have had a few, usually private conversations with people who have engaged in some of this misreading to inflame, let's say, white centrists or white liberals against sort of the type of racial justice work we want to do. And almost always, these individuals describe my work in a way that I can't even recognize. And so, to give an example, one of the interventions I sought to make in how to be anti-racist was an attempt for us to really separate, for us to move from a perpetrator-focused conception of the term racist to a victim-focused conception of the term racist, which is to say, there are so many cases in which a whole host of, let's say, Black people are being harmed by a particular policy or form of violence. And that perpetrator is specifically targeting Black people. And they're typically, in certain cases, benefiting from their targeting of Black people, a la Clarence Thomas, or that Black cop who is specifically targeting, as I think there was for instance, there was who is specifically like targeting Black women as opposed to white women for sexual predation. And so when we come across these cases, we tend to ask the question, well, who's the perpetrator? As opposed to who are the victims? And I mention that because I tried to make this case that, like, we should not argue that Black people are inherently anti-racist. We should not argue that Black people can't be racist. And we should look at the actual outcome of actions and policies. And I push back against the idea that a particular race is inherently racist or not racist. I mention that because one of the ways in which a certain segment of these propagandists sought to sort of shapeshift my work, and that shapeshifting was typically directed at white people, was to say to white people, this guy is saying that when you wake up every day, you're inherently racist and you're inherently harming all Black people.
The Christopher Rufos and these
yes,
right.
and that you are not only inherently racist, you're inherently evil because you're white, and all this sort of stuff, and because of my name, it was easy to essentially create a narrative and sort of attach my name to it. And frankly, some of those ideas, you know, were actually more connected to Robin's work than mine. You know, but as Toni Morrison sort of once actually spoke about in a book called Black Women Writers at Work, she spoke about how oftentimes when you have a black and white writer who are writing on a similar topic, that the black writer's work is assessed in relation to the white writer's work, that the black writer's work is not assessed on their own terms. And, you know, just always, it goes, and so I think that my work has been assessed in relation to the work of other white writers whose work were, let's say, as popular, which I think hasn't been fair to my work, or even the work of other black scholars and writers whose work were assessed. So we were all coming from different intellectual traditions, but we were sort of put, you know, all together, which I think was problematic. But
here we are. And nevertheless, and you know, you've been trying, I take it, to going back to how we started the conversation around policy, that's trying to, in some ways, through your institutionalizing efforts, to figure out how to respond to this by way of policy, to respond to the reality that you're describing. Talk a little bit about the substance of that. What does that look like on a review? What does it entail? What have been some of the recommendations or something that's come out of your efforts as you built these institutions around the country?
Well, let me say this. I think that what I've tried to convey is, I think many of us who recognize that the problem is not Black people, who recognize that the problem is the structure, then the next question becomes, like, what is the structure? And so I tried to talk about and allow people to begin to recognize the power, I should say, this powerful structure of policies, or the policy structure that ultimately leads to Black people being more likely to be incarcerated or killed by police or dying of heart disease, you know, or cancer. And for us to focus our energies there, for us to focus our intellectual and research energies there, as opposed to trying to figure out what's wrong with Black people, or particular groups of Black people.
Right.
But I face all sorts of pushback for simply rejecting the idea that there's anything wrong with Black people. And you know, the notion that I could say that any racial disparity where Black people are on the lower end is not caused by the inferiority of Black people, it's the result of racist policies. I mean, these folks think that that's just heresy. So then when I say, okay, give me an example of a disparity where Black people are on the lower of a dying end, that's not the result of racist policies. And then they start talking about the culture of Black people, racist idea, or the behaviors of Black people, racist idea, which they imagine to be that reality. And I mean, but how, I'm just curious, how have you, you know, wrestled with these people who, because what I've noticed, and I'm curious if you've noticed this, is there's been a movement from openly expressing that there's something wrong with Black people, particularly if they're not these right-wing Black writers, because those are the people who are primarily doing that. But it's their focus has ultimately been racism doesn't exist.
Right.
And if anything, they're saying that white people are the primary victims.
Absolutely. You know, part, you know, we work in different lanes, although we're both trying to tell a different story. our story of how we can account for our current circumstance. My task is to, in some ways, bear witness to the lies that they tell, and to say in a very clear and concise way that they're lying. So, and to try to do what Baldwin said we must do in 1961, and that is crack open the American image to see what it hides and obscures. And there's this insistence that we must tap the root, right, to get at what actually motivates this retreat into fantasy, this need to lie about the current circumstances, right, of what has produced it. Because what we do know is that it was a set of deliberate policies that produced our world. Mississippi doesn't look like it looks by accident, right? And if we're going to get beyond it, we're going to have to be just as deliberate in our dismantling of it all as we were in creating it. But that first requires the admission, not, and sometimes, the admission for some of these folk, in my view, the admission is sufficient. Going back to the sentimentality thing. That's all I need to do is to admit to you that I am, in fact, that the country is, in fact, racist. And that admission should call for absolution. I've admitted it. What else do you want? I've told you, you're right. I've engaged in the self-flagellation that you call for. I did it. What else do you want? Oh, do you want the redistribution of resources? Do you want fair policies with regards to criminal justice? You want education to not reflect communities that are valued as opposed to others? Do you want us to address racial disparities in healthcare? I just admitted that I'm racist. Isn't that sufficient? And so I think part of what I've been trying to do in my own work is tell a story that exposes in certain ways how the lie functions. This is what I was doing in the beginning again. But also to kind of move, and this is in some ways a reflection of my own upbringing and folks like Professor Mike Perry and others, where I don't want to begin with Black folk from a position of deficit, right? Which is at the heart of cultural pathology arguments, right? So we don't begin there at all. And, you said it in a different way than what I would say. Problem has never been us. It's always been them, right? And then to that point, we're talking at a certain level of generality, right? That is to say, Baldwin has this distinction. I'm paraphrasing here. He says, I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white, and then they're white people. And that distinction matters, because at a certain level of generality, the identification of oneself as white means that you're identifying with a whole host of benefits that accrue to you inhabiting that particular, list. So I think part of what I've been trying to do from my lane, right, is to offer a different kind of language for the nation to understand itself, right, by way of telling a fuller story that exposes what's been denied, that exposes the fantasy for what it is. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think one of the things that I've even noticed in terms of, and I think you spoke directly to that, this notion that all a person has to do is just admit that they're the racist. And I've seen people, so, I wrote about in How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this largely came out of my research for STEM from the beginning, how the heartbeat of being racist is denial. And so much of STEM from the beginning was not only telling the story of those who were producing racist ideas, but also contextualizing how, almost every case they were arguing those ideas were not, quote, not racist. Mm-hmm. And that was relentless. Whether you're going all the way back to human traders, eugenicists, you name the group. They were like, oh, these ideas are not racist. This is scientific. This is godly. This is common sense. And it allowed me, particularly as an historian, to see that coupled with the production of an idea that Black people are inferior is this notion that idea is not racist. And this relentless effort to essentially maintain a common denialism among people. So I spend all this time emphasizing and showing the criticality of denialism as it relates to being racist. And then I say, okay, so then what's the opposite of that denialism? For people to actually admit that. And then what people do is they cut off that first part, that whole body of research on denialism, and then they focus on that second part. And then they just go on denying that they're racist, even after they quote unquote admit it.
And get angry when you don't absolve them and they admit it, right?
Yeah. And so I think that this is the challenge that we face with people who decide to read works on racism or transforming society from the standpoint of how can I interpret this book in a way that's going to allow me to say the same person after I finish it, or that can allow me to have a new way of reinforcing the status quo.
Yeah. One thing we can't deny there is that their misreading changed our lives, yes? That the misreading had an impact on so many different levels, right? Because, sometimes, liberal sentimentality can be beneficial. Right?
Yeah.
So even as you try to intervene in that, this is not what I'm writing. This is not what this something else is going on here.
Yeah.
Right. Suddenly you become the darling. And then you have to deal with what that means, right? And this is, we have a history of folk who were once the darlings of the liberal establishment, of the white chattering classes, and then decided to reject it. You could talk about Gwendolyn Brooks. You could talk about Mary Baraka or the Vera Jones or Mary Baraka. We could talk Ranger folk who once were lifted up as, C, and then suddenly they shift. So, you find yourself in one moment, the strong misreading of your work opens you up for all of this. And then boom, in the blink of an eye, we're in the age of Trump. And then you have to deal with all the arrows and slings that come. Because I know you don't walk. You don't walk. You have to walk in a hyper alert kind of way, given the nature of the environment. And that's an understatement, yes?
I do. And I think I do I would though like us to, I would personally though like to acknowledge the many, many people who didn't misread my work, and who are right now engaged in campaigns to radically transform systems and or in some ways inspired by my work, inspired by Begin Again, inspired by other works. And some of those people may be white, right?
Of course.
And I think though those people came to the work from a level of curiosity or introspection, and so I just want to
of course.
acknowledge those people. But the challenge is those people are not being platformed, because they're not part of the sort of dominant narratives, of this moment. But I should also add that I think one of the challenges that I've faced is when you have a certain segment of, let's say, white liberal